Have you ever had that strange feeling of being in a room full of people and still feeling completely invisible? As if there were a transparent glass wall between you and the rest of the world, where you can see everything happening, but you can't truly participate, can't truly be seen? You smile when you're supposed to, respond when someone asks you something, but inside there's this constant sense that you don't belong in that place with those people at that moment. It's a silent pain that lives in your chest, a loneliness that can't be explained because technically you're not alone. You're surrounded by people, you have conversations, you even laugh sometimes, but there's something deep and unexplainable that whispers in your ear that you're different, that you don't fit in, that you're a puzzle piece trying to force itself into a slot that wasn't made for you. Maybe you spent years trying to decipher this feeling, wondering if the problem is you, if you're too demanding, too sensitive, too complicated. Maybe you've tried to mold yourself, change your personality, adapt your interests, pretend to like things you don't just to feel included, just to experience that magical feeling of belonging that seems so natural to others. But here's the truth no one told you. That feeling of exclusion you carry is not your flaw. It's a deep psychological wound with roots much older than you might imagine, and understanding where it comes from may be the first step in finally understanding why you feel this way. Chronic feelings of exclusion are not just a distorted perception of reality, it's a complex psychological state, born at the intersection of our biological need to belong and emotional experiences that taught us from a very young age that we are not acceptable as we are. Jung called this the wound of the rejected persona, that part of us we developed to be accepted by the world, but which somehow never managed to find its place. Our brain is programmed for social connection from the moment we are born. It's not dramatic to say this. Our survival literally depended for millennia on being accepted by the group. Those rejected by the clan died. This ancestral programming is still active in us, which is why social exclusion activates the same brain areas as physical pain. When you feel excluded, your brain actually interprets it as a threat to your survival. But chronic exclusion is different from occasional exclusion. We're not talking about that time you weren't invited to a party or felt out of place in a meeting. We're talking about a persistent pattern, a way of perceiving the world where you systematically place yourself on the outside, where you unconsciously seek evidence that you're not welcome, where your mind automatically interprets neutral situations as signs of rejection. This pattern is formed through a process analytical psychology calls a compensated inferiority complex. Your mind, trying to protect you from the pain of real rejection, creates a narrative where you exclude yourself first, where you place yourself on the margins before others have the chance to do so. It's an emotional survival strategy, a distorted way of maintaining control over the situation. If I exclude myself first, at least the rejection was my choice. The result is an identity built around marginality. You start to define yourself as someone who is always on the outside, someone who watches instead of participating, someone who understands others but is never truly understood. And the more you identify with this position, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But let's go deeper, because chronic exclusion rarely comes alone. It usually walks hand in hand with something psychologists call emotional hypersensitivity, an increased capacity to perceive emotional nuances in others that, paradoxically, becomes a social curse. You can probably sense when someone is uncomfortable even before they realize it themselves. You notice that micro expression of irritation that flashed across someone's face for a fraction of a second. You feel the energy in a room shift subtly when you enter. This hypersensitivity, which should be a social superpower, becomes a constant source of anxiety because your hypervigilant mind is always scanning for signs of rejection. Every pause in a conversation is interpreted as disinterest. Every averted gaze is read as disapproval. Every subtle change in someone's tone of voice is processed as evidence that you said something wrong. Jung described people like this as having a thinner psychological skin, individuals who absorb the emotions of their environment more intensely than average. In the theory of psychological types, these traits often appear in introverted personalities with a highly developed feeling function people who process the world first through an emotional and relational filter. The problem is that this sensitivity, in a society that values extroversion and assertiveness, is often misinterpreted as weakness, shyness, or social inadequacy. And when you grow up receiving these messages directly or indirectly, you internalize the idea that there is something fundamentally wrong with your way of being. Here enters a defense mechanism that psychoanalysis calls identification with the aggressor. Instead of questioning a world that doesn't value your sensitivity, you begin to attack that part of yourself. You become your own harshest critic, anticipating others' rejection by rejecting your most authentic qualities first. That's why many people who feel chronically excluded develop what Jung called a false self, an adapted version of themselves that tries to fit social expectations but never feels genuine. You learn to hide your sensitivity, to minimize your emotional depth, to make jokes about your own intensity, all in a desperate attempt to be accepted. But the false self can never create real connections, because genuine connection only happens when we reveal who we truly are. And so you get stuck in a cycle. The more you hide, the more misunderstood you feel. The more misunderstood you feel, the more convinced you become that you must hide. There's also a dimension that's rarely discussed: exclusion as an emotional addiction. Your mind, used to this state of marginality, begins to feel strange when you are actually included. Genuine inclusion can generate anxiety because it breaks your internal narrative. It forces you to question the identity you built around being the eternal outsider. The chronic feeling of exclusion almost always has roots planted in childhood, but not necessarily in the obvious traumas we usually imagine. We're not just talking about school bullying or explicit parental rejection, although those events can certainly contribute. We're talking about something more subtle and therefore harder to identify: the trauma of non-recognition. Maybe you grew up in a family where your emotions were too intense for the emotional environment available. Maybe your parents weren't necessarily bad, but simply didn't have the capacity to understand your emotional depth, your need for genuine connection, your particular way of processing the world. You may have been a child who asked questions that were too deep, who felt things too intensely, who needed more emotional validation than was available. Attachment theory teaches us that we don't need to be physically abandoned to develop abandonment wounds. Sometimes emotional abandonment, having our emotional needs systematically misunderstood or minimized, can be just as traumatic. A child who grows up hearing phrases like, "You're too sensitive," "It's not that serious," "Stop being dramatic," learns that their emotions are inconvenient, that their natural way of being is problematic. Psychologist John Bowlby identified that children in insecure attachment environments develop emotional survival strategies. One of them is what he called anxious avoidant attachment. The child learns that their emotional needs won't be consistently met, so they develop hypervigilance towards signs of rejection while simultaneously protecting themselves by avoiding emotional exposure. That survival strategy that was useful in childhood becomes a prison in adulthood. You continue to operate as if the world were that initial environment where your emotions were inconvenient, where your authenticity was rejected. Even when you encounter people who could genuinely accept you, your mind is still programmed to interpret situations through that old filter. There's something particularly cruel about the trauma of non-recognition. It leaves no obvious evidence. There are no visible scars, no specific moments you can point to and say, "This is where I was hurt." It's an accumulation of small invalidations, of moments when you needed to be seen and understood, but were ignored or misinterpreted. Maybe you were a child who cried easily and were taught that it was shameful. Maybe you had fears that were ridiculed instead of embraced. Maybe your passions and interests were considered too weird, too intense, too different. Each of these experiences planted a tiny seed in your mind. You are too much, you are strange, you don't belong. If something inside you is recognizing this pain as I speak, you are not alone. Write "I recognize this" in the comments. Modern neuroscience shows us that the chronic feeling of exclusion literally reshapes our brain in deep and lasting ways. Neuroimaging studies reveal that people who experience chronic social exclusion develop different brain activation patterns, especially in the areas responsible for threat processing and emotional regulation. The amygdala, our emotional alarm center, becomes hyperactive in people with a history of exclusion. This means your brain is constantly on alert, looking for signs of rejection even in safe situations. It's like having a faulty security system that constantly sets off false alarms. You live in a state of low-level, ongoing tension, always expecting the next confirmation that you don't belong. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for rational thinking and emotional regulation, can become impaired. When you're constantly processing social threats, your brain allocates fewer resources to functions like decision-making, creativity, and genuine social connection. It's a vicious cycle. The more excluded you feel, the less capable you become of forming the connections that could break that pattern. But there's an even more fascinating dimension. Neuroscience has discovered that people with a history of exclusion often develop what's called an observer brain. Regions such as the superior parietal cortex, responsible for third-person perspective, become overdeveloped. You literally become better at observing social situations from the outside, analyzing interpersonal dynamics, and understanding behavior patterns because you spent so much time in the observer's position. This ability can become a valuable professional skill. Many therapists, writers, artists, and social researchers have this history of exclusion that turned them into exceptional observers of human behavior. Your pain has transformed into a distinct form of emotional and social intelligence. In the modern world, this dynamic becomes even more complex. Social media amplifies both the feeling of exclusion and the illusion of superficial inclusion. You may have hundreds of online friends, yet still feel profoundly alone. The constant comparison with other people's seemingly perfect lives feeds that old feeling of not being enough, of always being one step behind where you think you should be. Modern culture has also created new forms of exclusion: economic exclusion, digital exclusion, productivity-based exclusion. If you're not constantly achieving, growing, optimizing, networking, you might feel left behind. The feeling of exclusion becomes not just about not being socially accepted, but about failing to keep up with a society that values performance over authenticity. But here's something that could completely shift your perspective on this experience. What if the chronic sense of exclusion is not a flaw, but a sign that you need deeper, more authentic connections than most people? What if your inability to be satisfied with shallow interactions isn't a problem, but a valuable trait of your personality? Jung spoke of the concept of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who others expect you to be. For some people, especially those with heightened emotional sensitivity, this process necessarily involves periods of solitude, of not belonging, of questioning mainstream values and connections. Maybe your feeling of exclusion is, in part, your psyche, protecting you from connections that aren't truly nourishing. Maybe it's your instinct pulling you away from environments where you'd have to compromise essential parts of who you are to be accepted. Your subconscious mind might be sabotaging superficial bonds because it knows you need something deeper. This doesn't minimize the real pain of loneliness, but it reframes the experience in a way that's less self-destructive. Instead of "there's something wrong with me because I don't fit in," the narrative can become "I have high standards for human connection, and that sometimes means I need to wait longer to find my tribe." In Tonight Listard, analytical psychology suggests that some people are naturally drawn to what Jung called the individual path, a way of living that prioritizes authenticity and depth over conformity and conventional social belonging. These people often feel excluded not because there's something wrong with them, but because they're unconsciously searching for something different than what most people seek in relationships. There's a fundamental difference between being alone out of fear of rejection and being alone while waiting for genuine connection. The former is emotional paralysis. The latter can be intuitive wisdom. Learning to distinguish between these two states can be transformative. This also means rethinking what constitutes social success. Maybe you don't need a large circle of friends. Maybe you don't need to be popular or traditionally charismatic. Maybe your kind of person just needs a few deep, authentic connections where you can show your emotional complexity without fear of judgment. The truth about chronic exclusion is that it can be both your deepest wound and your greatest gift. It taught you to see the world differently, gave you empathy for others who don't fit in, and forced you to develop a deeper relationship with yourself. The person you've become through this experience, observant, reflective, emotionally intelligent, may be exactly what the world needs. Your feeling of not belonging might have less to do with you being broken and more to do with you searching for something rare. Real connection, authentic vulnerability, emotional depth. These things exist, but they are not easily found. They require patience, discernment, and the courage to keep being your true self, even when that means spending more time alone. Exclusion taught you about inclusion in a way people who have always felt accepted will never understand. It gave you access to layers of human experience invisible to those who've never questioned their place in the world. This unique perspective is valuable. It's necessary. It's part of what makes you who you are. If you've made it this far into the text, if something within you is recognizing this experience, know that you are not alone on this journey. Write "I see this" in the comments if this reality resonates with you. Your exclusion is not a design flaw. It's a trait of someone who needs more than superficial connections to feel truly alive. And that, as painful as it may be at times, may be exactly what leads you to the most meaningful relationships of your life.